Have you ever met someone so arrogant, so entitled, that they believe the entire neighborhood exists just to serve their ego? That's exactly who Karen was in our story. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was a self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. And if you've ever dealt with a homeowners association, you already know, when someone like Karen gets power, chaos is never far behind. But here's the thing. She didn't just pick a fight with me. She went after my son. And not just any son. My boy is an Army captain. He served his country, risked his life, and stood tall in places where most people would crumble. And yet, this woman, this HOA Karen, thought she could threaten him, intimidate him, and bully us into submission. The story you're about to hear is not just about HOA rules. It's about pride, courage, and what happens when arrogance meets unshakable strength. The first clash. It started with something small. Karen hated the American flag hanging outside my porch. Can you believe that? A flag that represents freedom, sacrifice, and unity. It was too distracting for a perfect little street. She marched up to my house one afternoon, clipboard in hand, and barked, "That flag violates HOA aesthetics. You'll need to remove it immediately." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe her audacity. That flag stays. I told her, it's not just decoration. It's family. You see, every time I look at that flag, I think of my son standing tall in uniform. I think of the nights I couldn't sleep, waiting for a phone call from overseas. I think of the pride in his eyes when he told me he made captain. That flag isn't cloth. It's sacrifice. But Karen didn't care. To her, it was just another rule to enforce. When she targeted my son, days later, my son came home on leave. He wore his uniform not out of pride alone, but because he had just come from base. And let me tell you, we walked down our street, shoulders square, metal shining. He looked like every parent's dream, strong, disciplined, unshakable. But Karen? Oh no, she didn't see a hero. She saw a disruption. She stormed over, venom dripping from her words. "Tell your son not to parade around here in uniform. This is a quiet community, not a military base." Can you imagine? Threatening a man who has faced combat zones, who has led soldiers, who has carried away lives in his hands. Threatening him because his presence didn't fit her perfect picture of suburbia. My son stood still, calm and unbothered. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply looked at her and said, "Ma'am, I've dealt with people far scarier than you. If my uniform offends you, that says more about you than it does about me." Boom. Just like that, Karen's face turned red. She wasn't used to anyone talking back, especially not with the calm confidence of someone who stared danger in the face and walked away stronger. Escalation. But Karen didn't stop. Oh no, entitled people never do. She started sending letters. First, to me, accusing my son of causing fear in the neighborhood. Then to the HOA board, claiming his uniform was aggressive attire. And finally, to my son directly, threatening fines, threats of police calls, even suggesting he find another place to visit if he couldn't respect HOA standards. But here's the kicker. My son didn't just brush it off. He kept every letter. He documented every word. Because discipline isn't just about battle. It's about patience, strategy, and knowing when to strike. And trust me, he was ready. Why Karen picked the wrong family? Karen thought we were weak. She thought a few threats would scare us into compliance. But what she didn't know was that my son has been trained for situations far more intense than a power-hungry neighbor. He knows about endurance, about standing firm when the storm hits. Every time she knocked on our door, we smiled. Every time she sent a letter, we filed it away. Every insult, every threat, every attempt at intimidation, recorded, documented, and tucked away for the right moment. And when that moment came, Karen was in for the biggest shock of her entitled life, the real power of respect. Here's the truth. Karen never understood respect. She thought power came from rules, from threats, from holding a title on an HOA board. But real power, it comes from integrity, from sacrifice, from earning the kind of respect that no title can give. My son earned that. He didn't demand it. He didn't bully anyone for it. He simply lived it. And when Karen tried to take that away, she ended up exposing herself not just to us, but to the entire community. Strong hook into Section 2. And this is where it gets wild. Because what Karen didn't realize was that my son wasn't just a visitor. He was a protector, a strategist, and someone who knew exactly how to turn the tables. She thought her threats would silence us. Instead, they set the stage for the biggest showdown our neighborhood had ever seen. But let me ask you this. What happens when someone who lives for control suddenly loses it all in front of everyone? Stay tuned, because in the next part of the story, Karen's empire of intimidation begins to crumble, and my son, the Army captain, teaches her a lesson she will never forget. CTA for Section 1. If you've ever dealt with a Karen, you know how dangerous unchecked entitlement can be. Don't miss the next chapter, because trust me, this fight is just getting started. Share and stick around for part 2, where the HOA finally meets its match. Have you ever noticed how bullies act the loudest right before they fall? They talk big, they make threats, they stomp around like they own the world. But deep down, they're terrified. And that's exactly what happened with Karen. At first, she seemed untouchable. She had the HOA board on speed dial. She had her stack of violation notices. She had her smug little smirk whenever she walked by. But the day my son decided to stop ignoring her and start pushing back, that was the day her entire empire of intimidation began to crack. And let me tell you, it cracked fast. The calm before the storm. One evening, my son sat with me at the kitchen table, a pile of Karen's threatening letters stacked neatly in front of him. He looked calm, but I could see the fire in his eyes. This wasn't just about a uniform anymore. This was about respect. "Dad," he said, "you taught me to stand tall, even when the odds look stacked against me. I've dealt with worse than this. It's time to remind her that intimidation has no power over truth." That's when I knew Karen was done for. Because when a soldier decides to take a stand, not with anger, but with calm precision, you can bet the outcome will be final. The turning point, the very next HOA meeting, Karen marched in like she owned the room. She had a stack of complaints about us, waving them around like trophies. "This family has broken more rules than anyone else," she barked. "They disrespect this community, and something must be done." People shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. You could tell they were tired of her drama, but no one had ever dared to challenge her. That's when my son stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't slam the table. He simply walked to the front, in his uniform, holding her letters. And then, in the calmest voice you can imagine, he said, "Karen, you've threatened me for wearing the very uniform that protects your freedom. You've sent letters full of intimidation, lies, and disrespect, not just to me, but to my family. And now, I will read them aloud, so everyone here can decide who is truly disrespecting this community." One by one, he read them. Every petty word, every false accusation, every line where she crossed from rule enforcement into harassment. And as he read, you could see the faces in the room shift. Shock, disgust, anger. By the time he finished, Karen wasn't standing tall anymore. She was sinking into her chair, red-faced, unable to look anyone in the eye. When the community finally spoke. For years, Karen had controlled that neighborhood with fear. But that night, the spell broke. One neighbor raised his hand and said, "I've been fined 3 times for things that weren't even against the rules." Another said, "She made my kids cry when they played in the yard." Someone else muttered, "I thought I was the only one dealing with this." And just like that, Karen's army of silence turned into a wall of resistance. People began sharing their stories, their frustrations, their anger. She had ruled with intimidation, but now, exposed in the light, her power was gone. The lesson Karen never expected. Karen tried to defend herself. She sputtered about rules and standards and order. But every word she spoke only made things worse. Because the truth was clear. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. And here's the irony. My son, the Army captain she tried to humiliate, was a very symbol of discipline, respect, and order she claimed to value. She had tried to tear down the one man in the room who had actually earned the right to lead. By the end of the meeting, the board had no choice. They removed Karen from her position. stripped of her power. She sat there stunned, like a queen without a crown. After the fall, in the weeks that followed, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, freer. Kids played without fear being scolded. Neighbors actually smiled at each other. And my son, he became a quiet hero to many of them. People stopped by to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him how his courage gave them the strength to finally speak up. And Karen, she avoided us. Gone were the days of her marching across the street, barking orders. If she passed by at all, her head was down, her steps quick. The woman who once acted bigger than life had been reduced to silence. Why this story matters. Some people might say this is just a neighborhood drama, just another HOA story. But it's more than that. It's proof of something bigger. That bullies only have power as long as we give them silence. That respect can't be demanded. It must be earned. That true strength isn't loud or cruel or entitled. True strength is calm, steady, and unshakable. Karen learned that lesson the hard way, and she learned it from the one person she thought she could bully, the soldier who stood taller than her entire HOA board combined. The hook for the ending. So here's the question I'll leave you with. What happens when we stop letting Karens run our lives? What happens when we choose courage over silence, respect over fear, and truth over lies? Because if my son's story proves anything, it's this. Entitlement always falls when it collides with honor.